It is great to be with you all today. Wonderful to be back on campus. I've been on your side of the podium. I think it's been a long time since I've been in this room. Both when I was in your shoes, a little bit excited, a little bit anxious about what the next steps might be as I got those coveted letters MBA. As Garth kindly pointed out, my education at Stanford opened doors for me to have opportunities at a number of major companies. But I would also say, as I look back, the story is not as neat as it sounds in the resume. And I've encountered, just as I believe all of you will, bumps and bruises along the way, twists and turns that certainly challenged me, challenged my resolve. And navigating those twists and turns that come along the way is a big part of our collective challenge. I love my work with Habitat and feel greatly privileged to get to be a part of this mission. And as I look back, I can see how all the different experiences along the way helped prepare me, even if I couldn't see it at the time. I certainly don't pretend to have all the answers as to what makes a great leader, but I can share a little bit of what I've observed. Your experiences and your choices are going to determine your individual journeys, but I hope you can benefit from a little of what I've seen from both the roles and some of the people I've had a chance to observe along the way. Like you, I've read books on leadership and collected my share of quotes that inspire me. Among those is a quip by leadership expert and author John Maxwell, who offers this tongue-in-cheek word of encouragement. When you're getting discouraged as a leader, said John, think of Moses. He led 1 million complaining people for 40 years in the desert and never arrived where he was supposed to get. Moses faced a lot of complaints, criticism, and just plain whining. Some days as a leader, I can sympathize with Moses. I bet if he had to do it all over again, he'd make a note to self. Next time, don't tell Pharaoh, let all my people go. You know, leadership's hard. I think the more people you attempt to lead, the harder it gets. And Moses is a good example. And as Garth laid the groundwork, I'm going to share today in the context of my personal faith, and because my story doesn't really make sense without that. But I hope, regardless of your own faith perspectives, that the principles behind it will resonate with you today. One of the first lessons I'd like to offer around leadership is a common sense one, is the importance of role models. And I think all successful leaders identify either individuals or some composite of individuals that they want to emulate. And they may be great bosses, teachers, counselors, parents. In my case, I was blessed both with a mother who had a ferocious sense of justice and was very active in the civil rights movement, and a rather formidable grandmother, a woman named Millicent Fenwick, who was a civil and human rights pioneer, and New Jersey Congresswoman, who encouraged me and my siblings at an early age to think about what we were going to do to serve the lost and left out in the world, or in her words, to be useful. Walter Cronkite later called her the conscience of Congress. I don't know how many of you have read the comic strip Doonesbury. My grandmother is often referred to as the model for Gary Trudeau's character Lacey Davenport in the Doonesbury strips. And she had a rather imposing regal presence, and prior to her public career, she had the unusual distinction of having written the Vogue Book of Etiquette, which sold 1 million copies in 1948. And so in order to graduate to the grown-up table at Grandma's house, you had to be able to sit up straight and hold your fork properly and discuss food problems in sub-Saharan Africa, which was both fascinating and terrifying as a young child. And she was intimidating, but was also spiritual at her core, and almost every time I would see her, she would at some point drill in and quote Micah 6:6-8 from the Bible. He has shown you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you but to act justly, to love mercy, to walk humbly with your God. So act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. Pretty good marching orders for most of us. And that's become my life verse as well, though it took a long time to grow into that. I didn't come to Stanford right after college. My original plan of going to law school and then into politics got derailed when I realized I had no actual interest in practicing law, so I had to come up with Plan B and talk my way into a job at Goldman Sachs. And despite the latest images, this is a tough month for that company. one of the most important lessons I learned early was from one of the co-leaders of Goldman at that time, a man named John Weinberg. And there were a lot of less senior people in the firm who were caught up in their own power. But John Weinberg took a personal interest in virtually everyone. And he had a deep personal respect for everybody in the firm. And that's been something that's been critical to me to watch, both for people I was going to potentially work with or for, or also now when I'm hiring people, to see, how do they behave towards the receptionist or the custodian or people that don't have potential positive influence for them as a sign of character. And not everyone will agree, but to me a sort of core tenet of leadership is that fundamental respect for all people in organizations. I wasn't a great fit as a financial analyst. I was a poli-sci English major with no accounting or finance preparation, and had to suffer hard to live up to the idea. I sold myself the idea I could learn finance faster than I could teach someone to communicate. I'm not sure it was totally true. And I found it really intellectually interesting, but not very emotionally satisfying. And was living in New York City in Times Square, and the sort of juxtaposition of walking past these huge numbers of homeless people every morning and evening against the sort of big mergers and acquisitions and financing deals, I think caused me to do some hard thinking. And I also had a growing sense of a disconnect between the life I'd imagined living and the way I was actually spending my time at that point. And so felt I'd become really interested in business along the way, but felt it needed to go off and have an adventure, and was lucky enough to get the Loose program. And to put the coaching in perspective, they only qualified because they were the host team. And there were some parallels to the Jamaican bobsled team. But we did beat the Japanese. So for those of you who know Asia, that was significant. And it was a huge life experience for me as an immersion experience. I was living in the Korean training camp with all the coaches and athletes. And the only other non-Korean I got to see was a Russian boxing coach who was also in the dormitory. And is sort of unfathomable to most of you, a world with no internet, no email, and staggeringly expensive phone calls. So really quite isolated from all my relationships. And so it gave me a lot of time to read and think and reflect. And the only Westerner I saw on a regular basis was a man named Jim Peterson, who was the other Loose scholar that happened to be placed in Korea that year. And he was a pastor and ethics professor teaching at one of the great Korean universities. And Jim was one of those rare people who had both the intellectual rigor to go as deep as I could go theologically, and at the same time, which really caught my attention, an inner peace and a quiet confidence that really contrasted, I think, to my sort of raw ambition and need to impress people. And Jim took the time to get to know me and then made really a quite extraordinary offer. He offered me all of his Monday nights for the rest of that year, and we ended up spending 3 to 5 hours every Monday night walking through the Bible and doing systematic theology. So I got my private seminary. And I think for some people, and you all have your own experiences, faith can be a sort of burning bush event. Less so for me. I had to have that integration of head and heart. So it was a very gradual process that eventually got me to what Soren Kierkegaard calls that leap of faith. But it was finally became clear to me that the kind of life I wanted to lead was one of faith. And that was 1987. And I think for me, hasn't necessarily made life easier, but unquestionably for me has made life better and richer. And so as my time at Korea was coming to an end, I applied to business schools with the thought, and Stanford was the cutting edge of this, that the skills I could acquire in the business world were desperately needed in the nonprofit and service world as well. And Stanford was very intriguing to me because the public management program was integrated into the regular business curriculum. While at Stanford, I got interested in business strategy and how organizations grow. And after graduation, again, to choose your job criteria, my most important criterion was to get to Washington, D.C., where my then girlfriend, now wife, Ashley was. So had the chance to work with Marriott, working on new business development in their strategic planning group, and had a chance to, was enjoying it very much. Helped work on the launch of their senior living services, their adult care business, and got married, got promoted, life was good, and then though it pales in comparison, the S&L crisis hit. So for those of you historians, it was not a great not as bad as now, but was not a great time for the financial world. Marriott actually nearly went bankrupt and made significant cuts that included our strategic planning team and me. And it was a little shocking to be laid off. I was newly married, and I'd lost my job. And even though it was sort of perfectly explicable, it was hard not to feel a little bit rejected. And turned out fine. I had the chance to start up a strategic planning group for the real estate arm of Disney, which was a really fun and interesting experience. Got to work on great projects, and I think Disney taught me a lot about being a fanatic about great customer service, which I really appreciate. But there was another side of Disney, which I appreciated a little less, and that was sort of the Burbank studio culture at the time. And one of the former execs I won't name was very well known and behaved for quotes like this: "If you don't come in on Saturday, don't bother coming in on Sunday." Or a little more frightening, though humorous, other companies do good cop, bad cop. We do bad cop, antichrist. And it was not good to apologize at the beginning of any negotiation with an outside party for the inherent unreasonableness of our position. But it leads to lesson number 3, which is you have to be very careful about becoming a leader or working in a place that doesn't operate in sync with your personal values. And I mean, obviously that starts with having to know your personal values. And as I was sort of struggling with the implications of this and sort of what kind of career I could have there, headhunter called with an opportunity to come to Circuit City. And there's correlation but not causality that at least 2 of the companies I work for don't exist anymore. But Circuit City was on top of the world actually then. They'd been the fastest growing stock on the New York Stock Exchange for the entire 1980s. And they had just started CarMax. I don't know how many people are familiar, but it was actually revolutionized the used car business and was the first time anyone had ever offered warranted, fixed price, returnable used cars. And I thought that was really interesting. So we moved to Richmond, Virginia, and I never intended to be in retail, but found the work really interesting, learned a lot, but had a growing desire to run something at this point. And I'd been doing lots of business development work. And so after 4 years, phone rang again, and quite unexpected, and this was Musicland, which is about a $2 billion retailer at the time, back when people actually bought music and movies on plastic discs, which is another thing that's hard to believe. And we were the leading mall retailer of entertainment products, and that has a disappearing category. And Napster had just launched, so they could see the future and offered me the chance to run the operations and help navigate a new path for the company. I can't say my wife was terribly enthused. She couldn't really understand why God would want a nice southern lady to move to Minneapolis, the land of endless winter. And but I had a very strong sense it was what we were supposed to do, and she grudgingly agreed. And so we made the move. We actually had a couple of record years, and yet one of the more discouraging things from a business perspective, it was very hard to see how the company could survive, not just against the brick and mortar, but against the inevitable digital transformation that was coming. So we ended up selling the company to Best Buy, which was a great win for our shareholders and a great loss for really ultimately for our staff and for Best Buy. It was not a great acquisition. And I stayed for a year to help try to make the acquisition work, but also then became clear that I was redundant with the appropriately put in Best Buy head of the division. And so Best Buy was kind enough to offer some different opportunities, but I'd had a growing sense that maybe it was time. It had taken much longer than I expected, and maybe this was the time to begin the transition that I'd always planned to the nonprofit world. And I'd been increasingly passionate about some of my volunteer work, which had been helping coach pastors and priests in the leadership side of churches. And so even though I regularly counsel people, don't ever leave without knowing what your next step is, in this case, made the decision to jump and took off with some big ideas and a fairly ferocious non-compete clause. But I did have a walkaway package, so it was not a very particularly brave move. And for us, the freedom meant I was going to have a huge amount of time with, at that point, our very young children and at home with Ashley, and time to have enough space to sort of really think about the next step. And a little while after that actually encouraged me to do something I'd never had time to do and always wanted to do, which was to go on an international mission trip. And I know many of you have done this now, or a service trip. I'd wanted to go to Uganda, where our church had been sponsoring all the AIDS orphans in the Rakai district, where AIDS really broke out. But I was too late to join that trip, and ended up, through a series of events, being able to join an opportunity to serve with the Dalits in central India. And the Bungi, even among the Dalits, commonly known as the untouchables, are the traditional outcasts in Indian community. And the Bungi are at the sort of bottom of the social pecking order, literally only allowed to hand clean latrines and clean up after dead animals, and living in conditions that really are unimaginably bad. And about half the kids without some sort of intervention are dying by the age of 13 from a combination of poor nutrition and poor health. And I think for me, just shattered me to see people living in these conditions. And it was, I don't know that I knew, but I essentially, after a couple of weeks there, came back with a pretty strong sense that it was time to spend the rest of my time doing something to help the poor. And I think for me, it reignited some of those early passions around social justice that had softened down a little bit over the years. It was what Bill Hybels, pastor Willow Creek Church, calls a holy discontent. I thought that was a nicely turned phrase. And we have plenty of discontent in our society. We see that all over the place. People are watching some terrible event unfold in their community, the world, and the response is, that's terrible. Somebody ought to do something about that. And then they change channels and watch American Idol. And a holy discontent, in contrast, is when you or I see those same terrible events unfold in our community or in the world, and the response is, I can't stand that, and I'm going to do something about it. And you turn off the TV and get off the couch and get out into the community and decide to be try to make the world a little bit better. So I came back with a new passion, but not a very clear direction. And what took me aback was, for the first time really in my whole life, suddenly all the doors were closing. And now I can look back and sort of see why none of those were the right things, but got to the finals of a couple of different really exciting nonprofit jobs and didn't get them. And I think we MBAs are particularly at risk of defining ourselves by what we do. So when people would ask the inevitable question, I had a sort of a matter of discipline to sort of bite my tongue and resist the urge to say, I used to be XYZ, or I used to do XYZ, and just to say that, I was home with my family and trying to figure out what I was supposed to do next. And I'm not a particularly patient person, so waiting isn't very easy for me. And I think when you wait and question, it can drive you a little bit nuts for us type A types. And when I'd first left Best Buy, I turned down some very good business jobs. And then I started wondering, did I get the signals wrong? Did I miss the opportunity? And in the meantime, I was cranking way up on my volunteer time, both with our kids and at their school and at church. And quite unexpectedly, all the leadership development work I was doing at our very large church ended up with the church asking me to come and run the church as executive pastor, to free up the senior pastor just to teach and preach. And it was not what I was looking to do. And most of my friends thought this was a really bad career move and would not be a smart thing to do. But as best I could tell, it was what I was supposed to do. So went into full-time church work, and in fact loved it. And it was a great time for our family, and it was a very fulfilling time for me. And I was not actually looking when probably the most important phone call I've gotten came in. And it was from a partner at Spencer Stewart who had recruited me in the past, who asked, Jonathan, do you know anybody who'd be interested in CEO for Habitat for Humanity? And a kind of chill went down my spine, and I asked a little bit shyly, does it have to be somebody famous? And then went home and wrote a very passionate letter about why this was the kind of thing I had been preparing for the last many years. And I felt like finally here was something that really combined all of my passions and put everything together. It was, for me, very much my dream job. And I really wanted it very badly, did not expect to get it, and was very surprised and delighted to have the chance. And that's a lot of detail, but I share that because the fourth lesson I would share is You know, my dad was a teacher, and he taught in one place for 45 years and then retired. I think that world has changed, and I think in the business world especially, careers are enormously more fluid than they used to be. And what I would encourage you is to not fight those detours along the way, and particularly to take advantage of the learning from the white spaces in your career and the failures, which I often found were the richest learning times for me. I arrived at a really critical inflection point for Habitat in many ways. Like very successful startup companies, they were in the process of transitioning from a highly charismatic entrepreneurial founder and had grown far bigger than they'd ever imagined, and needed, in the board's view, more professional management and to build out a sort of infrastructure and leadership team to support this exponential growth that they'd had around the world. Habitat needed to become more efficient, more sustainable, and more equipped to be able to continue to sustain the growth given how much the size of the need in virtually every country in which we serve. I think many of you, I presume almost everyone's familiar with Habitat, but let me give you just a quick Habitat 101 class. Most importantly, we build houses in partnership with, not for, families who need simple, decent, and affordable homes in the US and across the world. We don't give the houses away. Homeowners make a down payment and purchase their homes from us on a no-profit basis. Homeowners are selected based on 3 core criteria. First, need. They wouldn't be otherwise able to obtain a home loan or mortgage. Second, the ability to repay a very affordable no-profit mortgage over a 15 to 30-year period. And third, the willingness to partner with Habitat. And for us, what partnering means is the willingness to put hundreds of hours of sweat equity into building their home and helping build other people's homes, and also to go through financial and home management training in preparation for home ownership. In the same way, then, their mortgage payments revolve in the community so that in addition to being recipients, they become donors to help other families have a chance at home ownership. As a Christian ministry now working into our 4th decade, we've got a pretty good idea of what to expect when a family gets, for the first time, a decent place to live. We see huge impacts on health. The children growing up in decent homes have much better health outcomes. Healthy children have much better educational outcomes. And in addition to the sort of physical and material benefits of home ownership, there's a huge psychological change that happens as well when people have a place to call home. And what we've seen over and over again are family members are so proud of their new houses. Their homes become social centers. They become anchors in the community to stabilize communities. And many communities have been lifted from forgotten, blighted areas to areas that have been restored and become inviting neighborhoods. In fact, now, with the housing crisis, purchasing up these empty, foreclosed homes has become a high priority for us. So we're shifting our mix more away from new home construction towards rehabbing empty homes. And in that, and around those rehabbed homes, tearing down the worst ones, building targeted new ones, and then doing weatherization and repairs to help preserve home ownership, especially for the elderly in those communities. And in that, trying to do as much as we can to revitalize whole communities versus individual homes. That's the Habitat model. It's a model that's been effective now for well over 30 years. As Garth said, last year we helped over 61,000 families through a mix of new homes and rehabs and major repairs, which is almost triple where we were 5 years ago. The nonprofit world is, I think, at least as complex from a management perspective as anything I found in the business world. We have over 1,500 affiliates in the US, which goes back to that Moses quote. I think once had a report in the New York Times say that this big change we were putting in had caused 12 affiliates to get upset. And I just laughed. I thought if there was anything we ever did that only 12 affiliates were upset at, we would be doing hallelujahs. But when you add all that together, we're actually the largest private home builder in the United States. We serve in over 80 countries. If you aggregate all of the Habitat budgets together, it's about $1.5 billion in terms of total revenue. And we increasingly are able to play a significant role in terms of shaping housing policies around the world as well. Stanford stood for the idea, all the way back to Ernie Arbuckle, that the same skills that will make you successful in the for-profit world are needed in the nonprofit world. And I took that seriously, but I can tell you it is more true than ever now, and I think it's a much more widely accepted idea now as well. I know certainly we're being called to use those skills. We've set a new goal at Habitat now to serve 100,000 families per year by 2013, which is going to challenge us to continue to find new ways to scale up and increase in our impact in the communities in which we serve. And I feel very blessed to have a small role in that process. I have the sad part of my job is I continue to travel across the world to places and see the way the families live all across the world. And it is truly heartbreaking still, and you know the numbers. But I've also had the chance to see what, just as we call a hand up, not a handout, can do to let a family lift themselves out of poverty and the fundamental difference that can make in life. Last year I looked into the eyes of a 6-year-old girl in a small town in El Salvador who told me her dreams of being a lawyer so she could help others. Her mother was already living her dream. She'd always wanted to be a hairdresser and have her own salon, but had never had the chance. And now she'd opened a salon in her new Habitat home. And as soon as the girls who could now go to school went off, she started treating customers, and she's able to earn an income and spend the time with her girls. In Vietnam, last fall, I met a family, 51-year-old grandfather who had literally spent his entire life living on a boat with his extended family. And we have the privilege of tucking our children into bed. They would tie the children in at night because they'd lost one grandchild to drowning in bad weather. And if you could see the boat or the boats these families were living in, it would just break your heart. And I had the privilege of dedicating with them. We talk about a house being the foundation for a decent life. Well, this family, for the first time ever, was going to have a foundation and live on dry land, which meant their kids could now go to school. Unbelievable health impacts for them and for their future. So my days don't get much better than that. And quick review, the leaders I've respected the most have emulated good role models and picked the right ones. They respect and value all of their staff and teams. They find a place to work that is in sync with their defined personal values, and they remain adaptable and as eager to learn from their failures as their successes. I think for me, when I look back on the story, my life changed dramatically for the better during one of the sort of quiet times in life when I wasn't earning a dime and probably was most frustrated. And I don't think I could have ever charted the path that led to Habitat. I wouldn't have been ready for this role if I had come straight from Best Buy. And I also know that if I'd taken the job at the church just so that I could get a job like Habitat, I'm fully convinced that never would have worked. It is, in my experience, the times that I really loved work were when I was really focused on getting projects done or doing something that mattered. And the least successful were those when I was focused on trying to grow my career. And my hope for all of you is that you'll find the same satisfaction. I hope and pray that each of you will find a vocation that allows you to take your gifts and skills and passions and do something, whether in the private sector or the nonprofit world, that makes the world a little bit better. I think we all get bombarded constantly, and you all are and will continue to be bombarded with definitions of the good life that base everything based on the size of your salary, and the house you live in, the car you drive, how much plastic surgery you've had, how perfect you look. And I think it brings me to the final lesson. As you get increasing responsibilities in leadership, I think you'll be awash in temptations. And I think you've got to be very intentional about defining what a good life is for you and pursuing it, because the lure of letting other people define that for you is very tempting. And it's very easy for all of us to get our egos and identities caught up in our jobs or intermixed with our jobs. And I find I have to be more careful than ever now that I'm in a comparatively public position. As a son of a classics professor, I think we all need to be very careful of the idea of hubris, that idea of literally putting ourselves on par with the gods. When I see the things that blow leaders up, and usually it's around money, sex, and power, they're really all wrapped up in pride. And you have to be aware of those temptations. And I think the ones who say, that could never happen to me, that's often the first step down that path. And I've seen some dear friends and otherwise really effective and great leaders totally derail not only their careers but their families because they weren't aware of those temptations or didn't think it could happen to them. In my experience, it's better to be humble than to be humbled. And I don't think you have to think of humility as a limitation. Jim Collins, who was a GSB entrepreneurship professor back when we were here, before he became a guru, discovered that idea of a level 5 leader in his research. And I was so pleased to see that And that idea of people that, he would say, paradoxical combination of personal humility and fierce ambition for their mission or cause. Not that level 5 leaders have no ego or self-interest. In fact, they're incredibly ambitious, but it's ambition for what they're trying to get done rather than for themselves. And tied to that is integrity, which we just see over and over again can be destroyed in an instant. Warren Bennis, another leadership guru, describes effective leadership as a carefully balanced three-pronged stool of ambition, competence, and a moral compass. And sadly, we can't watch the business news these days without seeing what happens when you have destructive achievers, high ambition, high competence, and no moral compass. And leadership ultimately starts or emanates from character. And character comes from a Greek word that literally means a tool that marks or engraves us. And each day, each choice, each action we make, we're in a constant process of either making or unmaking our character, either moving more towards the kind of person we want to be or moving back. And it's ultimately how our colleagues and others are going to measure us. So you have to choose those values you're going to live by. You've got to choose the lines that you're not willing to cross before those situations actually come along. And finally, you've got to lead from passion, not just from position. And I hope, I didn't always know. I sort of had lots of passion, but very little focus. And I hope you can all find that area of passion for you. What is that issue, that problem, that thing in society that you look out and upsets you or you think could be done better or could be fixed? What's your holy discontent? And that might be the first clue to what your calling is. Frederick Buechner, theologian, says, calling is where the deep gladness of your heart meets the world's great need. And I think it's worth, take some reflection to put those together. But if you can, then you'll be ready when the right phone rings or when that right call comes. So what are your dreams? What problems do you want to solve? What price are you willing to pay to make that happen? As we close, and I hope to turn into a conversation, I just want to share my favorite blessing from the Franciscan tradition. May God bless you with discomfort at easy answers, half-truths, and superficial relationships, so that you may live deeply within your heart. May God bless you with anger at injustice, oppression, and exploitation of people, so that you may wish for justice, freedom, and peace. And may God bless you with enough foolishness to believe that you can make a difference in this world, so that you can do what others say cannot be done. It's great to be with you. Thank you. I think we have time for some questions, and I think they asked if people would wait for the mic to be passed down so they can capture them, so everybody can hear.
Well, thank you for coming. I wanted to ask a question going back to the sale of Musicland. It seemed like you had some different constituents there that had competing interests between shareholders and your team and maybe even customers. And I was curious how your faith and how Christian principles informed how you balance those interests. And in particular, was it difficult for you to reconcile the sale of an asset that it seems like you had some suspicions was a failing asset and maybe the sale wouldn't go well?
You know, I think the interesting thing was Best Buy had a hypothesis that turned out to be flawed, but they had a model of using the real estate and the huge number of relationships we had with teens in malls to leverage those for electronic sales. And so it was a plausible strategy of why it was going to be different than it was going to migrate away from music. And it didn't work. But I think they were way more optimistic, and we were more optimistic at the time that was actually the best path, because otherwise we could see sort of a long eroding tail where we'd just be closing stores as leases came up. Because retail, as you know, the leverage is so strong that relatively small decreases in sales wipe out all your profitability very quickly. So it's a very thin business. But I think it is, much easier to look back now with all the data than when you're looking forward. But Best Buy was on a roll, and they had the financial strength to underwrite the sort of revamping of the stores that we didn't have the capital to do. So it was it struck us as, at the time, as sort of the best option for everybody, though it's, you know, everybody should go through a merger. Being acquired once, you know, that's an incredible education of, I think the danger of almost every acquisition is, even if they're done for strategic purposes and you acquire because you want the skills and gifts of the group you're acquiring, there's an acquirer's bias that I've seen, whether when I was in the investment banking side or in the operating side, where the acquirer tends to think they have all the answers. And so they, I think Best Buy made some major strategic mistakes by not fully understanding what the assets they were buying before they put all the changes in place. But it's, I think it's a constant juggling act of all those stakeholders.
Well, thanks also for coming. I think a lot of times ministry organizations have a lot of difficulty in the management of people, how they hire, how they fire, how they grow. Many times they can't fire just out of obligation or out of, you know, some. Can you just kind of talk about how you've managed Habitat, if you see some of those issues when you came in, and how are you going to grow and build the business going forward?
Thank you. It's a really interesting challenge, I think, and actually it was so, that's part of why it's so valuable to work in a church environment before coming to Habitat, which, and if you want the most complex management challenge in some ways, try to manage a synagogue or mosque or church, because you've got immense ownership, all volunteers, very little leverage over the people doing all the work, and enormous shared ownership of the mission. So they're great assets, but great complexity as well. And what I found is that was really helpful to learn is you can manage volunteers. And if you can manage volunteers, you can it's much easier to manage people. But we learned that you can hold volunteers accountable, that actually you need to do the same work to make sure a volunteer is in a role that he or she values and uses their gifts well. One of the things that faith groups do poorly is often they'll take really high capacity people and put them in the wrong roles. And Habitat was doing the same thing. And so the second thing I learned is that, you know, you're not doing someone a favor by letting them sit in the wrong role, not being successful. That's bad for the mission and actually bad for the individual. And so I was sharing with a group last night, you know, I think what I had to learn was that it has to be integrated. I get pushed, you know, often as we put in change and sort of significantly raised accountability, that got thrown back as, well, you're not being faithful anymore. And that sort of either we were going to be grassroots and faithful, or we were going to be professional, and that was termed going corporate, and that was viewed as a bad thing. And the response was, no, you know, we're using other people's money to do God's work to serve the poor of the world. We should have much higher standards than the private sector because the stakes are so high. So we're going to be unapologetic about accountability. And much of the practice we do would be standard in any well-run organization, I hope, in terms of making sure everyone has very clear roles, very clear responsibilities. They know what they're supposed to be accountable for, and that then we reward them for doing their work. It's I think it's hard though, because there's that whole being nice. You know, if anybody here from Minnesota, so there's you know, they call Minnesota nice, so the land of Lutherans and Lake Wobegon, where you know, nobody wants to say the hard things. And I think part of my view is, it's not, again, you don't have to be nice or you know, bad cop antichrist model, that you can be both nice and be really clear and transparent. And sometimes there's the other thing we see in nonprofits, for those of you who are thinking about nonprofit management, is you get two groups, I think, in nonprofits. One group who are people with world-class gifts and skills and talents who are there because of the mission. And I think there's another group, sometimes, who are there, you know, somewhat as refugees or to be rescued rather than to make a difference. And that's really hard. And it is, what we found is we want to treat people respectfully, we want to treat people well, but at the end of the day, the first thing is the mission. And what we can't do is allow somebody who's not performing well, because if you send a signal that it's okay not to perform well, that starts sort of demotivating your high-performing folks and pulling them down. But it's not easy.
Hi, thanks.
Hi.
One of the things I've been most impressed about is your ability to scale over the last 5 years. Can you talk about what are some of the levers that you pulled to be able to do that in the nonprofit world, and what are some of the challenges that you face going forward as you look at taking it to the next level?
Thank you. It's, you know, some things, you know, true, every organization, the best ideas are all at the field level. So we certainly didn't come in and say, here are all the great new ideas. I traveled around the world and just looked for what was working, or what were all the things people were secretly doing but didn't, you know, weren't saying because they didn't think that would be okay back at headquarters. And we tried to give permission to, and a couple things particularly drove growth. One, right as I started, Katrina hit, which was not on my 100-day plan, but it freed us up to break a lot of rules in terms of doing something. We need to do something big by our standards in the Gulf. So it forced us to sit down and sort of reassess the model of how can we do enough to matter in that. So we got the board to formally bless disaster recovery as a formal part of our work, which had been informally there for a while. And we used the tsunami in Asia and Katrina in the US as models of scaling up. We ended up helping 23,000 families in the tsunami, which was way bigger than anything we'd done. And we were we may still be the leading home builder in the Gulf Coast since Katrina, which again is not a typical role for Habitat. But in doing that, we used that to learn how to move faster and to do whole community development and operate at a scale and operate in partnership in ways that we hadn't before. So now Haiti and Chile, we're going to try to help 50,000 families in Haiti and a similarly large number, we hope, in Chile over time. So disaster response was big. Second one was housing microfinance. And microfinance extremely well established, but almost 90 to 95% of the people in the world have no access to a home loan of any kind. And so in addition to so we do housing lending out of necessity, but it's not our preference. So one of our goals is to get the microfinance world to begin lending for home improvement loans to families that have been taking out successful small business loans. And we see that as a huge next scale up. We're launching a global housing microfinance fund to be a wholesale lender to MFIs, and then we'll do technical assistance if they'll do the lending. And we see that as one of our next big bridges for scale. And then the third one would be around advocacy, trying to actually change policies so we can impact way more people than the houses we build. And our big focus is on secure tenure and property rights, especially for women in developing countries. So we're trying to change rules to create protections. And again, if we can, use crises to do that. So we're doing big projects around HIV, widows and orphan programs in Africa, particularly in Southeast Asia. In India, in the tsunami, we used the chance to come in and serve. We titled all the homes along the Southeast Indian coast in women's names only and got the other nonprofits to do the same thing. That actually had a pretty profound social change in terms of changing the values there. So, and similarly in Africa, in a lot of countries, if a woman's husband dies, his family inherits the property, and the widow and children are left out. So we're trying to get laws changed to allow joint titling, and so we see the ability to allow families to stay in communities as a way we can scale way beyond our core building. That's a few of them. One back.
Thank you very much for coming. I worked in the nonprofit sector before coming to business school and was given the advice by somebody, excuse me, at the Millennium Challenge Corporation, who had gone directly from business school back to the MCC, that had she to do it over again, she really would have gone to the private sector before going to the nonprofit sector. And I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about, although your intention was clear to go to Goldman Sachs, what you learned in all of those years in the private sector that has made you more effective in your current role?
You know, it's a really good question. We were actually talking about it right before this session. I don't think there's a right or wrong rule. I think there are enormous benefits to getting private sector experience, and I think there are, if you were to generalize, and I think there are brilliantly run nonprofits that are better than most companies, and then there are awful lot of poorly run nonprofits still out there. Likewise, there are a lot of well-run companies and not so well-run companies, so you need to choose carefully. I think for me, my hypothesis was I would get more experience faster in the business world than could take that with me. I think what I would temper that with is the means to an end. I wouldn't take a job that you really don't want to do just so you can get to something else, because I think the chances of being successful aren't as good. And I think there are great individual opportunities. If you take an organization, take someone like Muhammad Yunus or Fazl Abed at Brock, if you could work with a leader like that, that would dwarf any business leader you could ever find in terms of sort of staggering entrepreneurial talent. But you have to find the right leader to attach yourself to. So I think my view is I would explore both paths if your passions are leading that way, and then pick the place you think you're going to get the highest learning curve and the most tangible experience in the shorter term. And then you've got to weigh in sort of the golden handcuffs trap of once a lot of people go in saying they're going to do this, and then they never actually make the move, and 25 years later they have all these regrets and they weren't that happy or fulfilled. So I think you have to be careful.
We have time for one more question.
We got up here.
Do you think this role is going to be your role for the rest of your working career, or do you see there being a next step for you?
Oh, thanks. If ever heard, is this the last job? I hold it loosely. The person who replaces the founder is usually the unintentional interim. So now I've made it 5 years, so I'm kind of hoping I'm over the beginning of the curve. But what I can honestly say is there's no other job I want, and that's the first time in my career where there isn't anything else I want to do. So I hope I get to do this for a very long time. It's not as family friendly. My kids like the church job a whole lot better, and that's a real tension of how much travel I do and trying to keep that. And I think we do annual evaluations as a family as to whether this is working or not. And they really believe in Habitat, but not at all costs. So, but I hope I get to do this for a very long time. The board gets that choice. Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Oh, thank you. Oh, fantastic. Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you.